to look across the broad IT services and telecom space that we cover here at TBR. We'll talk about some evolving relationships and the alliances in the IT sector in particular. We'll talk about what value-added resellers are doing and why their activities of late matter so much to everybody within the ecosystem. And then we'll get into enterprises working with network and IT infrastructure to drive digital transformation. So this webinar today, so I'm Patrick Heffernan, the Principal Analyst and Practice Manager for IT Services and Digital Transformation Professional Services. And I'm joined by Boz Christoph and Chris Antlis, also Principal Analysts here at TBR. And today's webinar is going to be a little different than what we've done in the past. It's going to be a little bit of presentation. I'm going to set the stage a bit, and then we're really going to have a conversation. As you can see from the subtitle at the top of the slide, this really is kind of the view from the road, because all three of us have been traveling more than usual over the last couple of months, and we just wanted to share some of the observations that we've collected, some of the things that we've seen and heard in our travels. So we'll start with kind of the IT ecosystem, the state of play right now, but I'll begin, of course, with a poll. So we're hearing a lot about what's happening with budgets. We're hearing a lot about what's happening with budgets, particularly with respect to the global macroeconomic climate. So the poll question from here for everybody is, will there be an increase in IT spending? Will there be a decrease in IT spending? Will IT budgets essentially stay flat? Or is it sort of still too early to tell? Is it still a situation where uncertainty around what's going to happen with the macroeconomic climate leads to nobody quite knowing what's going to happen with their IT budget? And by IT, I mean IT services, I mean cloud, I mean telecoms, I mean everything. So we'll come back to the answers to that poll in a little bit, but that's the poll question we wanted to start with. So let's look at the way that the IT services vendors that we track, and you can see all of them on this particular slide. This is a very classic TBR bubble slide, a bubble chart, that looks at the growth and looks at the margin for all the vendors that we cover in our IT services vendor benchmark. I think that it gives you a sense of where we're coming from when we talk about IT services by the fact that we look at each individual vendor and how they're performing, what their strategy is, why they are on this particular bubble chart. And we could spend an entire hour diving into each one of these or a selection of these vendors to explain why they are where they are. And you can see there's a really wide range of performance outcomes over the last quarter. And that wide range of outcomes really reflects a wide range of business models. Oracle services and let's pick DXC, not exactly the same kind of company, not taking the same business model approach to delivering IT services. And that's the other part of it. They are delivering different IT services. While they are all within the taxonomy that we use for IT services at TBR, it's still a wide range. There's still a lot of nuance. There's still a lot of different ways that IT services vendors that we cover are delivering. Despite all that, you can see the disparity between growth on one end and not so much negative growth, as I've been told not to call it, on the other end. And I think another reason that we see this disparity is because of the different strategies around partnering. And we're going to get into that deeper in a minute. But I want to just say a lot of the ways that this bubble chart is used, other than for a webinar such as this, is for the alliance partners, the technology partners, the other partners that these IT services giants have. They want to look at this and see how are their partners performing, where are their partners the strongest relative to others in the IT services space. So to come back for a minute to, you can see the arrow pointing at Accenture. I want to turn to Boz and just get his thoughts based on some of the travel that he's done. And just because Accenture is always the company that we have to talk about, because they have traditionally been one of the leaders in both growth and in overall revenue. Boz?
Sure. Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Couple of things just to kind of reinforce here what Patrick just said. When it comes to Accenture, who they are, some of the engines for growth, it's really about how well they manage their partner ecosystem. This is really something that has enabled Accenture to do as well as they are, as you're thinking about how the market is evolving, what buyers are expecting from the services vendors. So Patrick mentioned I was just recently on the road, and I spent almost a week with Accenture and SAP at the Leadership Council, and really there was a plethora of client use cases in terms of across industries, and really speaking, getting the sense of the true value of that relationship and what that relationship means to their clients, the joint efforts that they have, and a lot about how the two companies are evolving and how they are thinking about what's next as part of that relationship, and that what's next is what's going to enable even further growth for Accenture, thinking about how much of their own experience with SAP for their own internal IT, bringing that to bear, being the customer zero experience, thinking about what's next from customers when it comes to thinking about how much of the IT architecture can be standardized, some of the processes can be standardized, and what's the role of someone like SAP from a large enterprises, and even moving down the stack to more of an upper mid-market and mid-market clients, and what is the role of Accenture, how they can actually enable those transformation. Actually, they call it compressed transformation in terms of ongoing market efforts. So why I'm bringing this up is, this Leadership Council was a really good platform for clients to share their experiences, hear about from both Accenture and SAP and their clients, really how those companies are evolving and how they are changing and the impact of their value proposition. And I think it's something from TBR perspective, as we look at the bubble chart here, all these vendors that we cover, they often manage those two-dimensional partnerships, but now we start thinking about what's next and how that those evolve and what the expectations, how those commercial models, incentive models, the knowledge management that's required for the constant evolution of new portfolio offerings and how those are changing. So Accenture, and we're going to bring up on the next slide here, is we have something that we have provide some deeper dives into as part of our cloud ecosystem market landscape. It's a good example of how we here at TBR look at vendors through the lens of the ecosystem. So it's an excerpt of Accenture's relationship with the three largest hyperscalers, AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. And we start looking a little bit closer, how those business groups that Accenture has done for years, what's the impact on the value proposition, how our clients react to those in terms of revenue opportunities, new portfolio offerings, the headcount that they've been trained and certified, and so on and so forth. So it's just a sample of how we think about the ecosystem, how it's changing. And again, as part of the cloud ecosystem market landscapes, in addition to Accenture, we have another 9 similar SIs that are looking at their relationship with the hyperscalers. I brought up SAP a moment ago. We are evolving our research portfolio, start looking into expanding that ecosystem view for the systems integrators, for the technology and their technology partners, looking at the front office, customer experience, looking at the middle and back office with the relationship with SAPs and Oracles and the like, and so on and so forth, and the front end Adobe and Salesforce, for example. So we started looking at a little bit better understanding what does that mean to the clients, how clients are reacting. We're going to click down in a moment to the client's perception around it, but we just want to kind of set the stage here, thinking, someone like Accenture being as successful as they are, we know they are the 800-pound gorilla. They have the resources, they have the marketing spend, they have the resource investment, but all that is part of a bigger play. How much they actually gain the trust with their technology partners and how much they rely on technology partners to feed essentially the revenue opportunities across legacy and also emerging areas. We know that for Accenture, 10 of the 200 plus partners enable them to generate over 50% of their revenue. And it's another 10, close to 10 that close the gap, much larger. But then again, they have another 180 plus partners that they have to work with, and they work with as agile as possible when it comes to the scale Accenture is able to operate. So point being here is that no one can do it all, even Accenture being as large as they are, even though they're positioning themselves end-to-end. Everyone does position themselves end-to-end, but it's about thinking what's next. And for Accenture, what's next, looking into standardization, thinking about through the lens of, okay, what other clients we can serve, what's the opportunity market beyond our traditional persona with service, and where can we bring differentiation? It could be the industry lens, could be from the technology lens, could be from a change management lens, which is becoming more and more important because of all the churn and attrition that is happening at both at the vendor level, but also the enterprise level. Could it be overall knowledge management? This is something that is becoming more and more important, especially as all these new technologies get introduced by the ecosystem. So really very high level here overview of like what Accenture is doing, how are they thinking about their partner ecosystem, and just an example here of how we slice and dice and we do from a research perspective with someone like Accenture. Like I mentioned, there's a few others that we provide insights similar to this one as part of our cloud ecosystem market landscape.
Thank you, Boz. I'm glad you brought up knowledge management too. I think we could probably do an entire webinar just on the challenges that the vendors that we cover have with their own internal knowledge management and then with their knowledge management with their clients and with their technology partners. So now that we have the foundation, and again, as Boz pointed out, those last two, that bubble chart and then the view from the cloud ecosystem market landscape, those are our foundational pieces of research. So we're going to build off of those, and we're going to build off of the travel that we've done to tackle three things that are shaping what's happening right now in IT services and are going to continue to shape what's happening in IT services: growing IT budgets, tighter alliances, and fear of artificial intelligence. So look at that, a 50-50 split. That's surprising, keeping it flat and being uncertain about what's going to happen. We're hearing from our end that the IT services is going to increase. The spending on IT services, at least, will increase. And maybe what we're seeing in this poll is that we didn't split out IT services from cloud, where we do expect that there's going to be a little bit of a pullback on the amount of spend that goes towards cloud based on kind of a hangover maybe from the cloud spending that happened during the pandemic. So let's jump into the first of these, which is, CIOs and IT directors want more, expect more, and will spend more. So everything that we're seeing indicates that IT services budgets are going to be going up this year and into next year. And I think part of it is to take a giant step back. We've been hearing for over a decade how the IT services vendors and the consultancies have been advising their clients, the IT directors and the CIOs. They've been advising them on how to be part of the business, how to move from being IT as a cost center to IT as part of what drives the business, what drives growth, what drives optimization. And so really there's been a slow-moving generational change where the people who are making decisions around budget, the people who are making decisions around digital transformation from an IT perspective, have taken on that advice, have taken on those lessons and learned them and understand more now how to make IT part of the business. So with that, the implication of that is that they expect the technology is going to work. They expect the technology will consistently, continually deliver more for less. That is, they will get more out of their technology every time they renew it, every time they buy a new system, a new incident, every time they upgrade whatever they're doing within their IT architecture. They expect more out of it. The challenges then come around cost, as I mentioned, the sort of hangover with respect to cloud, and I think probably with other costs as well, and that's maybe what the uncertainty was in the poll that we took. So what I think is important to understand is that what we're hearing now is an emphasis on incremental change, on incremental improvements, on incremental ways to use IT to run the business more effectively. Excuse me. So we've talked a lot about digital transformation, but really what we're looking at now is sort of digital incrementalism, which is not very exciting. And Boz, we had a call today where this exact point came up.
Yeah, it was. We are basically so the voice of the customer research that this graph is from. So we do it twice a year here at TBR essentially. So we do like a once a year annual global survey, and then midpoint, just as we're speaking right now, we're in the midst of conducting direct interviews, in-depth interviews with the enterprise buyers, where we are essentially doing a pulse check of understanding like, okay, what's really happening? How has it changed over the last 6 months in terms of sentiment, spend, expectations, and so on and so forth. I think the last 6 months have been a really strong indicator, of a incremental change when it comes to what the expectations will be for the next 6 months and the next year, because the 2020, 2022, late 2022, I should say 1H, after the pandemic hit, like June 2020 through December 2022, those 18 months were really an outlier, essentially, of what the market was going for and expecting how it was changing. And there's still a fair dose of sentiment when it comes to, okay, there's an opportunity for the IT systems to work better. There's an opportunity for vendors to perform well. But as Patrick pointed out, looking at just the all the spend around cloud and really coming to realization that cloud is not as cheap as it was once sold on, or at least when buyers are not getting the ROI that they were promised on initially. It's making some of them to be a little bit more cautious, a little bit more careful with the spend in the next initiative. They don't understand the value of cloud. That's no doubt about it. It's more about where do I spend for cloud is just the entire IT infrastructure, or do I take cloud plus analytics? Do I take cloud and cyber? Trying to think about more strategic investments that will be a little bit more, getting the return. So that's putting some more pressure, obviously, on the vendor side, thinking about how can they demonstrate ROI at that speed, especially in today's environment when everybody's like, okay, we don't have to spend, but where are we going to spend? How often are we going to spend? This perpetual spending cycle, especially around subscription. I heard from one of the conversation from my recent travels was like, once you get on a subscription, it goes, the subscription just keeps adding up. It never goes cheaper, right? The subscription just gets you like, you can cancel the subscription. That means you have to turn off the light of the business pretty much. Right. But once you get on the subscription bandwagon, it doesn't go cheaper from that point on. And that's what I think buyers are realizing, and they're thinking about, okay, and they're putting some more pressure on the vendors. And I mentioned someone like Accenture and SAP looking at like what's the next stage of their business model going to look like, and thinking about how much they can actually use standardized tools, how much they can actually address common pain points across the different functions and different processes, as they're thinking about trying to package the pricing different, thinking about what does that mean. There's certain nuances when it comes to the buyers, if it's an SMB buyer versus a large enterprise buyer. I have to make that note here as well. And we know that I'll call them buyers with less than 1,000 employees, like a small and like a lower mid-market buyers. Those are the ones that are a little bit most concerned, which, for when it comes to the vendors that may be looking to address those buyers, so pursue opportunities in those buyers, they have to think a little bit more strategically of like, again, standardization is a good way, standardization of process is a good way to think about it, but also thinking about the ecosystem of like working with the local niche providers, maybe somebody who's actually on the ground and have that agility around pricing and knows the business a little bit better, so it's easier to sell through with those niche providers. So the large vendors are important. They're the backbone of the large enterprise programs. As I mentioned, Accenture success has been largely enabled by those large providers. But having those small niche vendors in your court is certainly becoming even more important as you're thinking about how buyers are expecting the spend to progress. On the other side, the larger enterprises are the one with the deep pockets, right? So you have to thinking about even more strategically about what does that mean. Everybody knows about digital, everybody knows about cloud, but it's about thinking about maybe not forget about the physical in the world of digital, essentially. Yeah. And that's an implication that even came up in the conversation today with a buyer we spoke to about operations technology. Thinking about those assets, thinking about the implication of embedding those. So how much that spend will come to play, maybe shift from traditional IT to maybe OT, or maybe there's a bridge that can be brought in together, because just cloud, the mainstream cloud services are becoming commoditized, and there's a more of a challenge for vendors to really differentiate as they think about, if it's from industry or if it's being more trusted by new personas, essentially.
Yeah, Vlad, you brought up a couple of things I think are really going to be important when we hear from Chris Antlitz later, and that's around enterprise and what enterprises are doing, and then also the OT side of it. Because, we tend to get, within the services space, we tend to get caught up in services, which at the end of the day is essentially people-driven. When you get to telecoms and networking, there's a whole lot of hardware and a whole lot of physical stuff going on. So, all right, let's talk about alliances for a bit now. I'll talk about from my own perspective, my own travel in the last couple of months. And I spent a day with Infosys down in New York City. And what really struck me was half of the analyst event was dedicated to the Infosys SAP alliance, what those two companies are doing together. So despite the fact that it was Infosys that put it on, they spent half their time talking about what they're doing with SAP. I think that just shows how we have moved to a time now where the alliances between the IT services vendors and the technology partners are so tight and so critical that you really cannot go to market by yourself without going hand in hand with one of your technology partners. That said, right now, you can find a partner anywhere for anything you want to do. There's no lack of technology partners out there for IT services vendors and consultancies to get together with. So that increases the importance of aligning properly around culture, around organization, especially around sales. Boaz, some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, like you said, there's no shortage of partners out there. It's a challenge overall. Think about what's the next model going to look like, and we have another graph here from the last voice of the customer that I mentioned a moment ago. It's really about that at macro level. We saw the biggest jump when it comes to the ranking among the buyers that are benefiting from the vendors that can support around creating a network with partners. Certainly not surprised, given the evolving market dynamics and the need for better collaboration among the stakeholders. What we think about what that means is that with the buyers that are recognizing the value of the ecosystem, they also need to, again, consider the commercial constructs Patrick mentioned a moment ago, that manages those relationships, so they can avoid that vendor lock-in, and they can manage the risk. We know that this is easier said than done, essentially, when it comes to how those commercial constructs are being managed. We are hearing more and more about the emergence of multifaceted alliances networks, or multi kind of like a party alliances approaches, where buyers are also seeing that as a positive, essentially. If they have only one kind of a vendor that can actually rely on and have a conversation with, I mean, could it be McKinsey, and then they can work with SAP and Infosys and Microsoft? Sure. I mean, buyers are not opposed to the idea, but they also expect those vendors to have really strong accountability practices, really strong kind of a KPIs that can measure those relationships. So this is where we start seeing maybe an evolution of maybe the outcome-based pricing as a mechanism, I guess, to manage those internal relationships. So again, it's a fine balance to strike, because buyers don't want to be bought into that vendor lock-in and have one vendor. But as long as that vendor brings in their partners to the party, to the table from the get-go, and have that discussions up front, I think that more could evolve. That could put more pressure on all the vendors, because that implies immediately vendor consolidation, right? Because why would they need 8 vendors when I can do it all with 4? It doesn't work, right? We are seeing that starting to happen actually on the technology side, and buyers starting to think about evolving their technology stacks and trying to be a little bit more efficient about how much technology do I need for all these processes. Can I just get rid of? And developing that clean core that can enable more standardization and faster time to market and faster time to ROI. So there's a lot of moving pieces, definitely on the partner side, and we see that multi-party alliance network setups as the way that vendors to go to market, as the way to buyers are seeing a little bit more through the lens of like, show me something I don't know. Show me something that you can actually do it as a team, because I don't want to pay, I don't want to double my spend, because I'm only spending too much on cloud. I'm only spending on our technology. So it's vendors need to be very creative, I guess, with their pricing and incentive models, how they go to market with their salespeople.
So this is the part of the webinar where we're starting to shift to the dark side, because we went from the positives around the IT services spend. We've talked about what happening in alliances and sort of the threat that alliance partners can actually pose to IT services vendors and consultancies. And now we'll talk about what everybody's worried about, and that's the fear of generative AI. We heard today someone tell us that AI was topic number 1 and skills was topic number 2, which actually kind of made me laugh, because I think, well, skills is really about talent, and if we're talking about talent, then we're immediately talking about robots. So I think one of the challenges around AI is going to be fully understanding what exactly it is, where the opportunities are, who's most at threat from it, who is going to most benefit from it. And so to me, that means there's a massive consulting opportunity around generative AI. There's, and as was pointed out to us this morning as well, just so many companies, so many opportunities, or so many options in terms of who you want to work with. Everybody knows ChatGPT now, but there's a lot of vendors out there that are providing something like that. And so there's the massive opportunity around consulting. I think there's also a massive opportunity around sort of spinning the cloud meter. I mean, getting more more cloud usage, just simply out of the need to process so much more data, so much more information by using generative AI. So the question then here, and this quote actually comes from a special report that our colleague Evan Wollicott put together that talks about the potential. It talks about a lot of things actually, including woolly mammoths. So highly recommend reading it. But it talks about the potential to displace custom software development and that massive, well, not massive, but good-sized business within the IT services space. Boz, thoughts on generative AI and where it's heading and what it's going to do?
Well, I mean, it's here to stay. No, I think it's got it out of the box and it's out of the bag. This obviously the biggest implication is on the skills, on the talent, on the staffing pyramids. I mean, AI is nothing new. Automation is nothing new. We know for years, especially in the IT services side, vendors have been dabbling with using automation for service delivery. They've been using automation for optimizing their staffing pyramids, and so they can do better margin performance as their wage increases kept crippling up. Obviously, we see that squeeze even more in the last couple of years, which at the same time margin got squeezed, which tells us that automation hasn't been that tool to be used to monetize and drive better gross margins, but actually just been an enabler for better, faster, more standardized service delivery. With GenAI, I think the implications when it comes to is like around large language models is that, you know, how do you start with? Where do you start? I mean, who do you sell it to? Do you sell it to the C-suite? Do you sell it to the business unit leader? So it's how do you staff it? How do you think about, okay, if I'm developing a large language model for supply chain versus for finance versus for HR, you know, do you build those individually in a silo and then try to connect at the enterprise level, or do you start from the top down? So it requires a lot of unfettered access of data, cross-departmental data. We know that this has been a challenge for a while. I mean, the interoperability of departmental data is, you know, there's always been a promise of like, oh, here's your, you know, kind of like the boardroom view. You can click and choose in whichever data. But we know departments are built in a silo because there's corporate functions that are built in a silo. There's still titles. There's still people that are within those silos. They deal and they work with their own organizations and their everyday pain points. So that's a challenge to think about. But also the bigger challenge is like how much cross-departmental data you want to share, even with ChatGPT, because now you start talking about different bots and different, you know, kind of like security protocols and whatnot that, you know, even if it's within the same organization, you know, there may be some cross-pollination of data that may or may not have to be, you know, should not be crossing the department data, the department boundaries and borderlines. So there's a lot of implications. Obviously, as Patrick pointed out, there's a massive consulting opportunity because there's a lot of education involved. There's also going to be a lot of like change in the types of skills that'll be required, you know, from code developers to code reviewers and, you know, thinking about who's responsible for the copilot notion, all that. So we're in the early days of thinking about the bigger, broader enterprise use cases. I would say that. But I think there's some very low-hanging fruits. But I think if vendors start to think about how to best position themselves moving forward, I think they need to look beyond the low-hanging fruits because those are hard to replicate when it comes to more sophisticated use cases require a little bit more trial and error, so to speak, versus the low-hanging fruits are kind of easy to. And when it comes to when the rubber hits the road, it gets hard to replicate, and that's the challenge.
Yeah, and Boz, you mentioned two things I want to highlight before we move on. One is this idea of unfettered access to data. That requires trust. That requires trust across an organization and trust with the consultancy of the IT services vendor, or as we're about to see, the VAR. And then you also mentioned being able to share across silos or data being siloed. And so again, we'll talk about, here come the VARs, their ability to see across silos within an organization because they sell to an entire organization. So why are we talking about VARs anyway? When you look at the size of an Accenture versus a CDW versus the company that Boz and I spent time with last week, SoftwareONE, you can see that when it comes to revenue, we are talking about a completely different scales. But in the last 18 months, we've probably had more conversations with VARs and with their clients and with IT services vendors and consultancies who are at a minimum, at least a little bit concerned about what the opportunity is that the VARs are tapping into and where could that go. So why do they have, something special that the IT services and vendors and consultancies maybe don't? And that's a real, as it says here, an intimate knowledge of their buyers' needs and their spending patterns. The value-added resellers of software in particular are seeing what software is being bought, how frequently it's being bought, often seeing how it's being deployed. They have well-established relationships. I think that's enormously important and kind of easy to overlook. It's easy to underestimate how much value-added resellers actually know about the companies that they're serving, about the vendors or the clients that they're serving. And while those clients can range from very small to very large enterprises, that sweet spot sort of in the middle there of the middle market is somewhere where the relationships have been so well established for so long that a company like SoftwareONE can really intimately know how one of their clients, how they're using technology, what their upcoming technology needs are, where they're really going to spend money. And so that leads us to the question of, okay, all right, that's nice, but what do they lack? What's missing from the VARs? Why is it that when you look at that chart there, you see Accenture so large and CDW so much smaller and SoftwareONE smaller too? Well, part of that is traditionally within consulting, you need permission, and you need permission beyond just technology. You need permission around business. You need permission around knowledge management. You need permission at the board level. And then the second thing is you do need experience in selling and actually delivering IT services. What I would say to both of those is that they can be overcome. Those things can be overcome through M&A, through acquisitions, and usually I talk about I talk about acquisitions, not M&A. But in this case, I actually do mean M&A. I think there is probably a lot of opportunity there for some merger activity within the VAR space and with VARs and IT services vendors. They can make strategic hires. They can bring in the right people that have the experience at IT services vendors or consultancies in order to expand that services business, the services side, the consulting side of the house. They can land and they can work with who they already have as enterprise level, really marquee clients. So the clients that CDW and SoftwareONE are serving, for example, include a lot of household names. Well, when they're able to take those clients and build their brand around what they're delivering to them, I think there's another opportunity for them to really become a threat. And then, of course, the last thing, the real sort of best opportunity I think I see for the VARs to become more important players within the IT services and consulting space is through something Boz was talking about a few minutes ago. That's that multi-party alliances where you have I'll throw out there, a McKinsey, Infosys, SAP, and SoftwareONE. That package altogether coming to a enterprise or even a mid-market, large mid-market client brings truly a complete all-in-one package. And it's an opportunity for the VARs to provide that both established relationship plus that intimate knowledge of what the actual software needs are, what the software spending has been, and where it's going. So, Boz, any other thoughts on the VARs before we move on?
Just keep around them. They're not to be ignored. I mean, that's really the bottom line because they do have a secret insight, essentially, into how to think about their clients. These are the same clients that everybody is targeting. They also have an insight into their partners and what their weak spots are and how they think about it. And you need to make better friends with the VARs because they have an angle that is often been overlooked by many.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the partners. That's something I forgot to say, is that they do understand the technology space much better than a lot of the IT services vendors, the consultancies do, because they partner with so many software vendors and so many independent software vendors. So excellent. So that's the story in the VARs. Now we're going to move to our colleague, Chris Analyst, who's going to talk a little bit about network and IT infrastructure ecosystem and enterprises. Chris, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. And hi, everybody. So I attended Mobile World Congress in Barcelona this year and had some insights that I wanted to share. So I'm going to just have some animation here. So one of the big themes from the event was private networks. And I saw a lot of demos. I saw a lot of material and people talking about private networks at the event. And there were other topics too, that we're talking about quite a bit. But the reason I want to talk about private networks is because, one, it's the theme of this webinar in terms of latest trends in IT services and telecom. And one of the things that I noticed there was this is not just about traditional players in the market. This is a broad ecosystem of players that are participating at various levels in the private networks opportunity. It includes, of course, service providers, but it also includes companies like hyperscalers, pure play software companies, chip manufacturers like an NVIDIA or Qualcomm, incumbent network and IT providers like the Ericssons, Nokias, Dells and HPEs of the world. It also includes systems integration companies like the Accentures and Deloittes of the world, as well as application developers and non-telco enterprises. So all kinds of players participating in this market opportunity, and I saw all these types of players talking about that opportunity at the event. The other thing that I noticed is in the demos that I saw, large enterprises are showing the way to digital transformation and Industry 4.0. So the industry's been talking about this for quite some time. I actually saw some of the demos of commercial environments that are using what I would consider to be digital transformation. So I'll give you one example. BMW in Germany, their largest manufacturing, one of their largest plants in Germany, they did an overhaul and they did a full digital representation of that plant. And basically by digital twinning that factory, they were able to derive different types of business outcomes in terms of optimization of workloads, maybe how they rearrange the plant. They can simulate it in a 3D realistic way versus having to do it in a physical way where it's more expensive. They were also able to optimize worker safety. They were able to increase productivity of the plant. There were some other benefits as well. The point is that here you have a tier one, very well-known enterprise that is looking at things like private networks, 5G, edge computing, et cetera, AI, all of those technologies, and how they're bringing that together in a way where they're actually demonstrating benefits in the business in terms of cost reduction and in revenue growth. So I thought that was very interesting. And obviously there's many other companies out there doing some very interesting things. But that was one of the demos that I saw at the event. And just talking a little bit more about digital twin, it really is starting to look like the initial gateway into the industrial metaverse. So what I mean by that is the industrial metaverse is maybe a concept that's not talked about as much. We tend to talk about the consumer, maybe the gaming, the collaboration, that aspect of cyber-physical immersion. But when you think about the applications of AR, VR for a industrial environment, when you start to think about digital twin and how you can bring those capabilities into an industrial environment and bring some of those business outcomes we just talked about with in the case of BMW. So digital twin, a lot was talked about there. I saw a lot of demos about that beyond just the BMW example. Companies like NVIDIA, the hyperscalers, there's other players, application developers that are all participating in making those use cases a commercial reality. So with that, we'll hand it over to Q&A.
Excellent, thank you. So we do have one more poll though, because it is May the 4th, so may the 4th be with you and all that. Have to absolutely ask, what is everybody's favorite? No, not what's everybody's favorite. I don't really care about your favorite. I care what is the greatest Star Wars movie of all time. I can tell you that as you're looking at these choices, Boz has not seen a single one of them. Haley, have you seen all of them?
I've seen all of them, yes.
You've seen all of them. Chris, have you seen all these movies?
Yep, I've seen them.
Okay, so we won't let Boz vote, but we'll let you two vote, and then we'll get the polling results. I will say I did see the first one, Star Wars, also known as A New Hope, in the theater when it came out in 1977. That's how old I am. But Haley, your favorite off this list, the greatest off of this list?
I think greatest would probably be Empire. My personal favorite, I think, would be Rogue One.
Okay. Chris, which is the greatest Star Wars movie off of this list?
I think Empire Strikes Back is probably the best, and I think Rotten Tomatoes concurs with that.
Chris, always the analyst, has to make sure he cites a source. And so now let's get the polling results. Yes, I would have said New Hope too. So yes, I agree. The Star Wars, the very first one, was very good. My son was watching Rogue One this morning when I was leaving for work. So that was one of his favorites. And he is the biggest Star Wars fan I know. And the way he described it was, you can't pick one. These four are all the first tier. He ranked them by tier. So these are the top tier of the Star Wars movies. So with that, we will take some questions. We've got one in the queue now, and it basically is around talent and layoffs. So the question is, as we've seen all the layoffs in the technology sector, what do you think are the implications for talent, either from, and I can't quite read this right, either from IT services or from enterprises? So I think the question means, what does it mean for IT services vendors, I guess, and then what does it mean for enterprises that there are layoffs in the broader technology sector? And then we've seen layoffs, of course, across, starting with Metaverse. Well, I guess maybe starting with Twitter if you want to go back that far. But really everybody, even to the point of Accenture making layoffs before their last earnings. Boz, you want to tackle that for a bit? And then Chris, we'll come to you for some thoughts on that. Boz?
Yeah, good point. Even someone like Accenture, that's such a well-oiled machine in terms of like talent management and managing to demand and all that. But I think it's just inevitable. I think if you look back in the last 24 30 months, pretty much since the pandemic started, the ramp up of hiring just surpassed the demand overall. Just thinking about that, everyone thought that we need to have people. So if you kind of peel back, it's like everyone pretty much hired about 30+% rate in the last couple of years now, streaming 5 to 7%, just there's still a net addition to the overall pipeline of people. It's unfortunate for any time anyone has to get let go, but it's just thinking about vendors that really getting a little bit more, they're sobering up to the reality of like basically many vendors and the enterprises, I should say, are where we were heading into late 2019, early 2020 before the pandemic. Basically, pandemic kind of pushed 3 years. That's what we're experiencing right now, and in a much larger scale in terms of like potential downfall. But in terms of the implications, I think there's an opportunity also for many of those folks that have been let go to join places like, the enterprises, because we see and we're hearing, some of the enterprises are rethinking how they evolve their own internal IT departments, how they actually thinking to staffing and actually taking advantage of the trained talent from the industry. And it would be the kind of like the go-to place for staffing and thinking about the next wave of innovation and start to use this trained talent to their own internal kind of business and IT functions as well. So short term, it's more of a margin fine-tuning on the vendor side. Long term, they have to be aware of how much they actually let go, especially if these people are letting go into the buyers themselves. One good thing is that if people that they're letting go are let go in a good term, so to speak, and they can turn around and recommend those vendors that they used to be part of, that's definitely a plus. That's kind of the McKinsey model, McKinsey Alumni Network, but a little bit in a different angle. But that's maybe a stretch of imagination on my end.
Chris, some thoughts on what you've seen from the telecom space with respect to layoffs?
Yeah, so the telcos have been laying off people for years. They've been actually, there was some data that just came out. AT&T, I think they laid off over 5,000 people in the last year or so. It was something like that. But the point is the telcos have been in a cycle of constantly looking for automation, looking for things to outsource, looking for things to optimize. And we see that still very much firmly in play. They don't tend to make big layoff announcements, but as part of the restructuring programs that they do implement, there usually is a roll-off of headcount in some way. Either they'll buy people out or, there's retirements and they're not backfilling. Those types of things are pretty pervasive among the telcos that we study. With that said, the telcos, they are trying to get into, they're trying to digitally transform as well. And, they're trying to hire talent. I think Vodafone's been very vocal about this, trying to hire software engineers, people with that type of talent to help them in their digital transformation journey. So I think it would, yes, the net headcount is coming down, but there are areas where we do see telcos trying to hire people. So it has to be, kind of thought about in that way.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, and I guess it's a huge opportunity for the talent out there that's moving from a Google or an Alphabet to some of to either to the enterprises or to the telecoms, like you said. So, Boz, the other thing is, yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing to that. So, Patrick, to your point, since the beginning of last year, there's been over 200,000 tech layoffs globally. And Patrick, as you said, there's a lot of talent in there. And this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for companies that have been struggling to get talent. And yes, the economic environment may be, not the greatest, but I think that companies should really be taking a long-term view here and investing into the down cycle and acquiring this talent that now that it's freed up. I think that will set telcos that are proactive with that, or any company for that matter, that's proactive with that now, I think will be set up to win or have an advantage, as we come out of this, out of this downturn on the economic cycle.
Yeah, and Chris, so that's something that we actually heard last week, and we've heard a lot, which is this idea that because there's now talent on the market, it's an opportunity for a lot of enterprises, telcos and others, to stop paying for IT services vendors and consultancies to be training talent on the client's time. So instead of, we need to do a digital transformation, bring your fresh young talent and we'll train them on how to do digital transformation as we're paying for it. Instead of that, which has traditionally been part of consulting, there's no kind of getting away from that business model, but maybe this is a way to kind of slice it a little bit. But Boss, thoughts on that? Because I know you heard the same things I heard.
Yeah, I think it's something that's to be aware of, and it's hard for the vendors to have the right skills, talent, and retain them all the time. So it's a challenging order to ask from vendors, hey, we have all the talent and they've been with us for 10 years and they know what they're doing, but then you have to think about what you're going to be charging for the last 10 plus year, kind of like a 10-year talent. So there's that. So vendors have to think about that part, implication. Buyers, yes, they don't want to pay for vendors to train, their talent on their project, right. But they also have to think about how much they will pay otherwise, Right. So there's always that side of the equation as well, which brings, again, AI, which brings, automation and how much you can standardize. And going back to the beginning of the webinar today, the evolving value proposition from Accenture and SAP around process standardization and thinking about what's next and what's coming up, and from what buyers are targeting, how they're bringing up, will require a different way of bringing those go-to-market efforts, and will require different tools, they require different knowledge, kind of sharing and management and pushing the message with everybody else. Yeah, I mean, it's a moving target, right? But again, because from a buyer perspective, it's a fair amount that are already through transformation program. Others are just getting started.
So, all right, so let's talk about that for a minute. So, because Chris mentioned automation, he mentioned the telcos and automation, and we've had a lot of conversations about generative AI and what that can do. So, as part of what's going to happen to both to talent being displaced by generative AI, but also RPA. I mean, why do you need Blue Prism Automation Anywhere and UiPath if you can just ask ChatGPT to take care of it for you, to write the code for you?
Yeah, no, it's a valid point, because essentially RPA vendors are stepping stool, and again, they have had their name in the spotlight for the last few years, but I think it's generative AI is kind of like leapfrogging the opportunity that actually those RPA vendors can do. So it's putting more pressure on the RPA vendors to evolve their own proposition, to think beyond the core RPA use cases and thinking about, can they add more in terms of their portfolio offering, in terms of getting to be a little bit more, hey, from process mining to process development and review and all that stuff. What else is out there? Can we become the platform for services? Can we be the next service now, so to speak, for what from a portfolio stack? So that's going to be a challenge. That's on the RPA vendors to survive essentially, but because they also need to convince their services partners that there's something more than RPA vendors, because services partners they have a network of partners, and many of them are already on the GenAI kind of a bandwagon.
Right, and they can go invest somewhere else. So, all right, one last question in the queue. And if I had to sum it up, I would sum it up as, is digital transformation dead? It's kind of funny because Chris used the term digital transformation when he talked about the telcos and their digital transformation journeys. Boz, you lead our digital transformation practice at TBR. So the question is, quote, digital transformation, unquote, really still something customers talk about, or is there a new way of talking about technology evolution and business needs? Boz?
I'll give the consulting answer. It depends. Well, based on Chris's response, we know it, and I just said a moment ago, where you have buyers that are really just getting started, or they have moved in the last 6 months or 9 months, and then moving from legacy to cloud-based infrastructure and getting to the motions of how they can spend their IT budgets. And they have buyers that are further along. So if you have to think about what does digital transformation mean? It means different to different vendors, but there's a commonality across regards where you are on that spectrum. It's around business optimization. So digital transformation is more about business. How do you take advantage of any technology, even if you're just getting started? Maybe for those lagging organizations that are just getting started, there's some lessons learned, and avoid those mistakes, because there's so many use cases out there from within the industry or cross industries. It's why would I go there? Why would I do what something my peers did 5 years ago? Let's try to use the new technology. Let's try to leapfrog and catch up and whatnot. So again, it's going to put some pressure on the vendors to position their portfolio offerings, their partner ecosystem through different lens. But I think that the common ground is, if I have to to answer the question directly, digital transformation, then it's more about business optimization than actual kind of the mindset that's being adopted by the buyers.